Checkity, check. Just kidding. You're listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. My name is Mark Stanley, your host, and I just want to thank you for joining me for today's episode. I am looking forward to it, as should you be, because we are going to be talking about Vanity and one of the best Russian authors. I know at this point you probably just think that all we talk about is Russian authors, but one of the best Russian authors, Anton Chekhov. And we're going to look at his short story, one of his 400 short stories. It's called The Bet, and we will be comparing it with some biblical literature. The book of Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Bible, and the literary parallels are shocking and interesting. But before we get into it, I want to tell you that you can find more well-read Christian goodness on our website, wellreadchristian.com. You can support the podcast by liking our Facebook page or leaving a review on our Facebook page or on iTunes. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe from wherever you get the podcast so that you never miss an episode. So we've been talking a lot about the modern era of the 20th century and especially examining what in the world happened. I mean, 2 world wars, nihilism, depression, drug use, the rise of communism, all kinds of communist revolutions, the rise and fall of various nations, all sorts of things going on. And I spent a lot of time looking at the Russians as from the beginning of the Well-Read Christian Podcast. We spent a lot of time in Tolstoy, now in Dostoevsky. We took a brief detour with Nietzsche. That was great. But now we're going to jump into Chekhov. And when I say jump into, I just mean for this episode. But it's just interesting to me how the themes that we've been going on have centered often around Russian literature. First Tolstoy, and then Dostoevsky, and then later we're going to also talk about Solzhenitsyn. So it's just, it's funny to me how that's working itself out, that we're hitting a lot of the Russian greats, and now Chekhov. But it's just happened to be what I'm reading and what I'm interested in, and so that's what the podcast is going to reflect. So Chekhov was, if you're unfamiliar, Anton Chekhov is a Russian writer and a playwright. He's most famous for his plays, of which 4 of them became incredibly successful and influential. He also wrote a boatload of short stories. I mean, we're talking over 400 short stories before he was like 25 or something ridiculous. Some of them are hugely popular and intriguing, and we're going to talk about one of them today. It's called The Bet. It's only about 5 pages long, and I'm not going to read it for you, but I will read significant quotes. I'll summarize the rest of it. It's short. I mean, I could probably read it in 7 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that, but I won't do that. It's a very simple story, too, and before we get into it, I want to tell you a little bit more about Chekhov, because I went to the library and read more about him just for you, so you should feel so special that I decided to take the time to make sure that I was telling you educated things and not whatever I could find on Wikipedia or something. Because Chekhov is someone I don't know a lot about. I'm new to him, and I'm liking him already. But I haven't read a lot of his plays, only his short stories. And so this is one that I've always liked. And so I just wanted to make sure that I was giving you good information. So it's straight from the library, and if you read it on the internet, it's all lies. But if you read it in the library, it's absolute gold. We know how that works. So Chekhov was born in 1860. And he died in 1904. So we're talking parallel with Dostoevsky here. When it comes to literary influence, Chekhov ranks up there with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. He'd probably be the third. If you were going to rank all the most influential Russian writers, it would probably go Tolstoy number 1, Dostoevsky number 2. Some people would dispute which order those 2 should go in. But then Chekhov would probably fall number 3. And like I said, he wrote 4 plays which really hit as high as you could possibly go when it comes to playwright. I mean, he's up there. Tolstoy said that he's not as good as Shakespeare, which, I mean, at first you might think, wow, that's kind of an insult, isn't it? But it's like, no, if you're telling someone that you're not as good as Shakespeare, that means you've been referred to in the same sentence as Shakespeare. So that must be something. His plays were kind of a blend of tragedy and comedy. In case you recognize the titles, I'll tell you, his 4 most famous plays are The Seagull, Uncle Vanya, The Three Sisters, and The Cherry Orchard. And even though Chekhov's reputation rests on only 4 plays, he is widely considered to be the best modern playwright for sure. He had a huge impact on the English-speaking world, especially during World War I, and then there was a kind of a resurgence again in World War II. And the constant themes in his plays are hope and then disillusionment. All of them have the same themes. It's almost like he wrote 4 different plays that are all kind of one play. They're all romantic. They all feature a romance between a man and a woman of some sort, and oftentimes that romance is an affair of some kind. I was able to skim through some of the plays. I haven't actually read any for myself, but he strikes me very much as almost the Russian Scott Fitzgerald. He keeps a distance from his characters, but the way he describes them and the romance and just kind of the feelings that you get and the way that he describes certain things and the way some of the characters come off, he very much reminds me of Scott Fitzgerald's, specifically The Great Gatsby. I really love The Great Gatsby, and I think that I would love Chekhov too if I read more of him. But for now, we're only talking about The Bet. But one more word on Chekhov's style that I was able to ascertain from some research. So Chekhov's style did not rely on flashy experimentation or mimicry of the Enlightenment and some of the popular romanticism and as a counterculture that was going on in Europe, that of course the Russians were copying, many of them. And so Chekhov is surprisingly stable. He doesn't rely on kind of a cutting edge in order to be popular or profound. Many authors today do that. I mean, like contemporary. Same with artists. You know, a lot of people they'll try to do something completely different, and they'll call it unique and groundbreaking, and they'll be like, "Look, I I pooped in a box or something. It's modern art. Nobody's ever done that before." And we'll all go, "Well, you're right. I mean, nobody's done it before, I guess." I don't know if that makes it count as art, but apparently stuff like that gets put in modern museums these days. I mean, have you been to a modern museum? They are freak shows. All you got to do is just splash some paint or do something incredibly obscene and say that no one's ever done it before, and there you go. You just earned yourself a spot on the wall of one of the greats, apparently, one of the modern greats. But anyway, how did I get off track like that? I'm sorry. I should probably cut that. You know what? I don't think I will. Anyway, one of the things that Chekhov does in contrast to Tolstoy. So, for example, Tolstoy is passionate about human nature and happiness and history and free will and kind of the classic major themes that you would expect to find among a great writer to think about and to write about. And Dostoevsky, of course, as we've talked about, is concerned about the religio-philosophical future of Russia, where he sees the imported values and worldview of the Enlightenment, and he's confident that if Russia tries to follow the West, then they would crash and burn, as he foresaw that the West would crash and burn, just as Nietzsche foresaw that the West would crash and burn. And there was quite a lot of crashing and burning in the 20th century. More bloodshed than the previous 19 centuries combined, as I've said many times, which is a true fact. Look it up. And so Dostoevsky is concerned primarily with those things, and therefore he's considered one of the chief figures of existentialism and also early psychology in a lot of his writings. But Chekhov, he kind of has a pulse on the same things as Dostoevsky. He has his eye on the culture of Russia and the vast and strange shift that seemed to be happening very rapidly. There was the emancipation of the peasants that seemed to happen overnight that was very jarring on the culture. But then there was a lot of poverty and a lot of disillusionment when it came to the church and kind of the natural order of things, kind of the classical understanding of reality into a modern view of reality. Very rapid industrialization, lots of poverty, illness, that kind of thing. So Chekhov sympathizes with the peasants, and he's clearly repulsed by the aristocrats and the elite who are being quickly overthrown and hated very rapidly. Chekhov was a doctor. He practiced medicine. His grandfather was a peasant. His parents were kind of middle-class shop owners. And then Chekhov himself became a doctor in order to pay off some of the family's debts and things. But he was also a writer, obviously, since we're talking about him. He says that medicine is his first love, his lawful wife, and then literature is his mistress. So when he gets tired of one, he goes to the other. That was one of the things that he would say. And like I said before, Chekhov's themes in all of his plays are going to be hope, where someone idolizes something, someone just goes crazy over this one thing, whether it's a woman or whether it's an academic idol or whether it's an ideal, and then they become disillusioned eventually. And so they're comedies in the sense where the style is comedic in the literary sense, but then they're tragedies because they often end with either suicide or near suicide or kind of darker themes as someone becomes disillusioned and broken. But anyways, I don't want to get too far off track. I don't really plan on spending too much time in Chekhov. I just didn't want to talk about an author with you having absolutely no clue who this person is. So feel free to do some research on your own. I would like to jump right into the story as we have it. And so out of the 400 short stories Chekhov wrote, the Bet is one that's kind of emerged as a classic, especially in the English-speaking world. And the story is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to tell it to you straight, and then I'll read some quotes. So Chekhov sets up two characters who you don't even know their names. There's a banker and a lawyer. And the banker throws a party because that's just something aristocrats do. They throw parties. They feel like it, and so there you go. I'm rich. What are you going to do? And so the banker's throwing this party, and one of his guests is a lawyer. And they start talking in a little circle about capital punishment and whether capital punishment is right or wrong as opposed to life in prison. And so they're having this conversation about which is better, which is worse, which would you rather have inflicted upon you, is one immoral? And the lawyer says, well, they're both equally immoral, and obviously the state should not be taking away anyone's right to life. However, if you had to choose, you should definitely choose life imprisonment because it's better to live somehow than not to live at all. And so, of course, a lively discussion ensues, and there's lots of people on kind of both sides of the issue, whether it's better to just end it and be done, or whether it'd be better to live life in prison. And so the banker, who is younger and more nervous, suddenly loses his temper, and he bangs his fist on the table, and he turns to the young lawyer and he cries out, "That's a lie. I bet you $2 million you wouldn't stick in a cell even for 5 years. And so the lawyer says, why, if you mean it seriously, then I'll bet I'll not only stay 5 years, but 15 years. And so the banker says, 15, done. Gentlemen, I stake $2 million. And the lawyer says, agreed. You stake $2 million, my freedom. And so the wild and ridiculous bet actually comes to pass. And so the deal is that if the lawyer can stay in solitary confinement for 15 years, then at the end of it, he'll get 2 million rubles. And the banker is just trying to prove a point. He's trying to prove that solitary confinement and life imprisonment is immoral. And so therefore he goes, look, this guy's not going to do it. There's no way he stays in prison for 5 years, let alone 15 years, let alone 2 months. I mean, just the fact that you yourself are putting yourself in prison and could leave at any time is going to torment you. You're going to go insane. There's absolutely no way that you're going to stay in jail for 15 years. But you know what? If you do it, if you throw your life away, if you spend 15 years in prison, then 2 million rubles for you. Fine, that's not even that big of a deal. And so the bet is kind of ridiculous, right? But that's the title of the short story. That's the point of a short story, that it's ridiculous, but it makes a point. And so they hire guards and people to have strict observations of this man who is going to put himself in the garden wing of the banker's house. And it was agreed upon that the lawyer would be deprived of all rights to cross the threshold to the other parts of the house, to see any living people, to hear any human voices, and to receive letters and newspapers. he's permitted to have only this. He could only have a musical instrument, he could read books, and he could write letters, he could drink wine, and he could smoke tobacco. By the agreement, he could communicate, but only in silence, with the outside world through a little window specially constructed just for that purpose of him kind of making hand motions and kind of miming any kind of communications that he wanted. And of course, he could write letters too. So everything necessary, whether it's books, music, or wine, he could receive in any quantity just by sending a note through that window. And the agreement provided for all the most minute details, and they made the confinement strictly solitary, and the lawyer was to remain exactly 15 years from 12 o'clock of November 14th, 1870 to 12 o'clock on November 14th, 1885. And the least attempt on the lawyer's part to violate the conditions to escape, even for 2 minutes before the time of the official release. If he left on November 14th at 11:58, 1885, then the banker no longer had to pay him $2 million. So that's the deal. So they go, all right, let's do it. And so it starts. And during the first year of imprisonment, the lawyer, as far as it was possible to judge from his short notes recovered afterward, suffered terribly from loneliness and boredom. And from his wing, day and night, came the sounds of the piano. Because what else are you going to do if you're lonely and bored and in prison other than play the piano? So he spends that first year just playing the piano like mad in order to try to alleviate that depression and loneliness. And he rejected wine and tobacco. He said, wine excites desires, and desires are the chief foe of the prisoner. Besides, nothing's more boring than to drink good wine alone, and tobacco spoils the air. So during the first year, he was sent books of kind of a light character, novels with a complicated love interest, stories of crime and fantasy, comedies, and so on. But the second year, the piano was heard no longer, and the lawyer didn't ask for that fluffy stuff anymore. He asked for only the classics. And in the fifth year, we're jumping from the second year to the fifth year, now music was heard again, and the prisoner also started asking for wine. And those who watched him said that during the whole of that year, he was only eating, drinking, and lying on his bed. And he yawned often, and he would talk angrily to himself, and he didn't read anymore. So he'd play the piano, he'd drink wine, and he would read. And he stopped reading, excuse me. And so sometimes at nights he would sit down to write, but in the morning he'd wake up and he'd tear it all up. And more than once he was heard weeping. But in the sixth year, the prisoner began zealously to study languages and philosophy and history, and he fell on these subjects so hungrily that the banker hardly had time to get the books enough for him that he was requesting. And in the space of 4 years, about 600 volumes were bought at his request and sent to him, and he was going through them so fast they couldn't even keep up. Until one day, the banker got a letter from the lawyer, slid it under the door or something, and he says, "My dear gaoler, I am writing these lines in 6 languages. Show them to experts. Let them read them, and if they do not find one single mistake, I beg you to give orders to have a gun fired off in the garden, and by the noise I shall know that my efforts have not been in vain. The geniuses of all ages and countries speak in different languages, but in them all burns the same flame. Oh, if you knew my heavenly happiness now that I can understand them." And the prisoner's desire was fulfilled. He shot the banker had 2 shots fired off in the garden by the banker's order. Once the experts said, yeah, no, he wrote those 5 lines perfectly, and each of them in different languages. So pick your top 5 favorite languages and pretend that was you. Which 5 languages would you study and get absolutely perfect, and then read all of the best works of their of that language. And so later on in the 10th year, the lawyer sat immovable before his table and read only the New Testament. And so the banker found it very strange that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 volumes should spend an entire year reading only one book, and a book that's relatively easy to understand and is not that thick. I mean, just the New Testament is just not that long. And then after he read the New Testament for an entire year, that was then replaced the last year by the history of religions and also theology, various kinds of theology books and that kind of a thing. And so during his last 2 years of confinement, the prisoner read an extraordinary amount, quite haphazardly, just kind of random things. He would apply himself to the natural sciences, and then he'd read some Byron or Shakespeare, and then chemistry or medicine, and then he'd read a novel, and then a treatise on philosophy or theology, and all kinds of things. He just kind of was finding anything he could find that would entertain him for just another moment. He was so close. You could see that he was just kind of whimsically choosing whatever he could in order to satisfy that immediate urge. He was so close. And next thing the banker knew, it was the day before the man was to be released, November 13th, 1885. He could hardly believe it. It was 3 in the morning. The banker couldn't sleep. He said to himself, I cannot believe this idiot has actually spent 15 years in total seclusion, hasn't heard the voice of another human being. All he's done is read books and play the piano. He's mastered 5 different languages. He has the wisdom of 600 books. He has read the entire New Testament exclusively for a year. Think of how much you would know. You probably have that sucker memorized. If you read just the New Testament every day, all day, with nothing else to do for an entire year, man. And so this banker is just laying in bed at 3 in the morning. The snow on the trees outside, totally peaceful in November. And he's thinking to himself, I can't pay this guy his money. I am too broke. Over the last 15 years, while that guy was doing nothing but spending all my money on books and stuff, I've been gambling and making reckless investments and risky speculations. And if I pay him 2 million rubles, I'll be ruined. And so he's realizing that this guy is going to leave his house with all of the wisdom that he could have possibly gained from every book he could possibly get his hands on. This guy knows everything there is to know about every known science, 5 different languages. He's read every history book. He's read everything he could possibly get his hands on. He's mastered the piano. He's charming. He's good looking. He's still a lawyer. And this banker, who's been bankrolling all of it, is realizing that he's going to be destitute. He's going to end up being homeless, and this lawyer's going to be like, yeah, thanks very much. That was a good bet. And so what is he going to do? And so as he's pacing around his destitute, quiet house while everyone's asleep, he goes over to the west wing, to the room, and he realizes there's this door that has not been opened for 15 years. And just on the other side is the man who's going to ruin his life, basically, after he wins the bet. And he decides to go in there and kill him. And so he opens the door and he finds the man sleeping, and he walks through where no man has walked besides the lawyer for 15 years. All these books are open everywhere. The piano has been worn to next to nothing. And he walks over to the man and he realizes, okay, if I smother this guy with a pillow, it'll probably look like natural causes. After all, he's an older guy at this point. And so just before he decides to do it, he notices there's a note on the desk. And so he goes over to it and he begins to read. And he thinks to himself, okay, well, I'm going to kill the guy, but at least I'll read this because it'll give him a little more time to dream of the millions that he would have been able to obtain and the people that he would have been able to reunite with after he leaves my garden wing. And so he reads, and I'm just going to quote it straight out because it's very interesting. Quote, tomorrow at 12 o'clock midnight, I shall obtain my freedom and the right to mix with people. But before I leave this room and see the sun, I think it necessary to say a few words to you. On my own clear conscience and before God who sees me, I declare to you that I despise freedom, life, health, and all that your books call the blessings of the world. For 15 years I have diligently studied life. True, I saw neither the sun nor the people, but in your books I drank fragrant wine, sang songs, hunted deer and wild boar in the forests, loved women and beautiful women. Like clouds ethereal, created by the magic of your poet's genius, visited me by night and whispered to me wonderful tales, which made my head drunken. In your books I climbed the summits of Elbruz and Mont Blanc, and saw from there how the sun rose in the morning and in the evening suffused the sky, the ocean, and Lye mountain ridges with a purple gold. I saw from there how above me lightnings glimmered, cleaving the clouds. I saw green forests, fields, rivers, lakes, cities. I heard sirens singing and the playing of the pipes of Pan. I touched the wings of beautiful devils who came flying to me to speak of God. In your books I cast myself into bottomless abysses, worked miracles, burned cities to the ground, preached new religions, conquered whole countries. Your books gave me wisdom. All the unwearying human thought created in the centuries is compressed into a little lump in my skull. I know that I am cleverer than you all. And I despise your books, despise all worldly blessings and wisdom. Everything is void, frail, visionary, and delusive, as a mirage. Though you be proud and wise and beautiful, yet will death wipe you from the face of the earth like the mice underground, and your posterity, your history, and the immortality of your men of genius will be as frozen slag, burnt down together with the terrestrial globe. You are mad and gone the wrong way. You take falsehood for truth and ugliness for beauty. You would marvel if suddenly apple and orange trees should bear frogs and lizards instead of fruit, and if roses should begin to breathe the odor of a sweating horse. So do I marvel at you who have bartered heaven for earth? I do not want to understand you. That I may show you indeed my contempt for that by which you live, I waive the 2 millions of which I once dreamt of as paradise, and which I now despise. That I may deprive myself of my right to them, I shall come out from here 5 minutes before the stipulated term, and thus shall violate the agreement. When he had read, the banker put the sheet on the table, kissed the head of the strange man, and began to weep. He went out of the wing. Never at any other time, not even after his terrible losses on the exchange, had he felt such contempt for himself as now. Coming home, he lay down on his bed, but agitation and tears kept him up a long time. The next morning the poor watchman came running to him and told him that they had seen the man who lived in the wing climb through the window into the garden. He had gone to the gate and disappeared. The banker instantly went with his servants to the wing and established the escape of his prisoner. To avoid unnecessary rumors, he took the paper with the renunciation from the table and on his return locked it in his safe. The end. So it's a very fascinating story, one which is pretty easy to generate conversation about, I think. Here's a couple questions that if you're listening with someone or if you know someone who listens to the podcast, you got to ask them, hey, what'd you think of that episode on the bet? And here's some questions you can discuss with that person. First of all, would you take the bet? Not to, force someone to be in solitary confinement for 15 years, but would you allow yourself to be in solitary confinement for as long as, let's just say for as long as you can muster it? And the deal is that if you can be in solitary confinement for 15 years under those same conditions and you get out with 2 million's nothing these days, but 200 billion, would you take that bet? Solitary confinement, 15 years, 15 billion. Would you do it? Do you think you could take it? And obviously that's not the point of the story, but I think it's a fascinating conversation. I mean, Chekhov sets up such an interesting turn of events. And, it's kind of one of those like questions where you can ask yourself, hey, if I could have any superpower, which one would I want? This is an interesting one. How long do you think you could take solitary confinement if you had all the musical instruments you wanted, all the books that you wanted, all the food that you wanted? How long could you take it? And then, of course, there's the deeper question that I think the bet is actually striving to get at, and that's that this man, in his journey of 15 years of solitary confinement, what does he do? And of course, at first, he's lonely and he's depressed, and so he plays the piano in order to soothe his soul. But then after a while, he gets over the piano and he starts reading these kind of lightweight, fluffy books. And then after a while, he's only reading serious books, the classics, the best. And then he picks up piano again, and then he starts reading everything, absolutely everything. He studies all these different languages. He reads all of the best works from all the different languages. He starts reading the Bible, the New Testament anyway. He reads it for a year. You could easily read the Bible for much longer than a year. But he only reads the New Testament, and he keeps it to a year. And then he starts reading all kinds of different theology books, all kinds of different philosophy books, history books. He just dives right into it. And so the idea that Chekhov is setting up is that if you had all of the wisdom of the world, and I really mean all of the wisdom of the world, what conclusions would you draw? Would you be fundamentally a happier person? You see, what is it? What is the one thing that the world is going after, and it could be represented in literature and philosophy and in religion and whatever else? This guy, he goes in to this room for 15 years and he reads everything there is to read in the world, which is the point of the book, the short story. And he says, I don't want it. I've seen it. I've had my fill. I've read the poets. I've understood the philosophies. I've seen what you call beautiful. I've understood what you strive for. And I don't care. I'm done. You're mad. You've gone the wrong way. You've taken falsehood for truth and ugliness for beauty. I despise your books. I despise all worldly blessings and wisdom. Everything is void, frail, visionary, and delusive as a mirage. And though you might be proud and wise and beautiful, yet will death wipe you from the face of the earth like the mice underground. And your posterity, your history, and your immortality of your men of genius will be as frozen slag, burnt down together with the terrestrial globe. At the end of the day, this man says, vanity of vanities. All is vanity, which is exactly what the author of Ecclesiastes says. And if you're unfamiliar with the book of Ecclesiastes, perhaps you're not a Christian, or you're a Christian, you just don't really care about the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Bible. People oftentimes forget that the Bible is not a book, it's a library. The Bible is a collection of books. And there's a book of the Bible that basically is the bet. I mean, this Chekhov literally just kind of ripped off Ecclesiastes and wrote it himself. But Ecclesiastes is a story of Solomon as a king. And he is so wealthy and so powerful that he decides, you know what? I can just do whatever I want. So I'm just going to try to be happy. I'm going to do whatever I think I need to do in order to be happy. And so he pursues wisdom and he reads all these books and he pursues sex and he gets all these concubines and he pursues hard work and he pursues everything you can possibly imagine. Think of whatever you're looking for in life where you say, this is what's going to make me happy. If only I could reach that, then I'll be satisfied. And he says, I went for it. And you know what I found? Vanity of vanities. Everything ends up in the grave. It's all meaningless. Nobody remembers people after a few years, a few menial decades, and no one remembers you. There's no claim to fame. There's no achievement. There's no value out of all your toil. We're so caught up in our lives that we forget. What are you living for? What are you doing? And so the author of Ecclesiastes comes to the conclusion of a conclusion very similar to that of this character, the lawyer, in the short story, The Bet, where this character says, I despise your books, all your worldly blessings and wisdom. Everything is void, frail, visionary. It's a mirage. Death will wipe you from the face of the earth, and you'll be burnt down together with the terrestrial globe. You see, that's the very similar conclusion that the author of Ecclesiastes comes to. He says, self-indulgence is vanity. Living wisely is vanity. Working hard is vanity. All of it ends in the grave. There's nothing you can do to escape your inevitable fate. Try to be wealthy. Try to live honorably. Try to be highly esteemed when it comes to other people, looking at you and favoring you above others. Try taking all the money you can have. Try having all the sex you can have. Try drinking all the alcohol you can have. Try eating all the really good food you can possibly find. It's never going to satisfy. And that's the same conclusion that the lawyer from The Bet comes to. He realizes that every poet gives their profound insight and then they die. Every philosopher gives what they think to be the final word, and then the next guy comes along after he dies and refutes him and comes up with his own ideas. Everything is just vanity upon vanity. See, but here's the difference, and here's why you absolutely have to appreciate the author of Ecclesiastes over Chekhov, because the author of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he gives 2 words of wisdom, 2 ideas that he says can weather you through this reality. Everything is meaningless. Pain is abundant. Oppression is everywhere. He says, the more you increase in wisdom, the more you'll increase in sorrows. That's literally a quote. But he says there are 2 things that can get you through this harsh reality. Here's what you can do. 2 things. First one, Ecclesiastes 5, verse 18. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everything also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart. Then a little later, Ecclesiastes 9, verse 9. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hands find to do, do it with all your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, which is the place of the dead, to which you are going. So he says, whatever you're going to do it with all your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. You're going to die. And when you do, your works and your thoughts and your knowledge and your wisdom and your achievements, they're not going to mean anything. So enjoy life. Enjoy it. Work hard. Do it. Whatever your hands find to do it with all of your might. Every meal that you prepare, savor every bite. Every ounce of laughter that you can find yourself enjoying, enjoy it. That's how you escape. That's how you escape the frivolousness, from the emptiness. Every moment, enjoy it. And then there's another thing. This is the most important thing. This is the conclusion, the big huzzah that Chekhov's The Bet does not have, but Ecclesiastes does have. After all that is said and done, there's this masterful conclusion in Ecclesiastes. It's only 12 chapters, like I said. And in chapter 12, Solomon ends like this. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one raises up to the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms. The grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Then at the very end, verse 13, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So Chekhov says, if you had all the wisdom of the world, if you took this crazy bet and were in solitary confinement for 15 years in order to earn a ridiculous amount of money, what would the result be? You would read every book. You'd master 5 different languages, read the books in those languages. You'd master the piano. You'd be brilliant. And you know what you'd realize? You'd realize that it's all pointless, that there's no value to life, that there's no value to money, and that it's all vanity. And that's what Solomon came to the conclusion of a long, long time ago. But here's the difference. What Solomon says is 2 things, and here are the takeaways. Number 1, enjoy life. Enjoy life. Don't get caught up in the finances or the stress or the struggles. There will be enough of those. There are so many of those. You know that. But you know what? Enjoy the little things. Enjoy the food that's right in front of you. Enjoy the people who are around you. Be a good person. Maybe that way you won't make it so bad. Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to be a good person? Well, let me tell you, it ain't by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not how you're going to do it. Because you're not a good person. And that's where takeaway number 2 comes in. Solomon says, follow God. Remember him in your youth. Pursue him. Know him. Love him. Treasure him. He is the only thing that doesn't fade, that doesn't waste away, that actually makes sense. He spends the whole book saying, if you try to do good for money, if you try to do good because you want good things to happen to you, well, guess what? The righteous perish like the wicked, and the wicked prosper. And I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense. You can't, life doesn't make sense. But you know how you can make sense of it? You do good, you enjoy the little things, and you follow God. That's how to overcome it. So as we go into the holiday season, I want you to remember that. I want you to be thinking about Ecclesiastes, and I want you to be thinking about the bet. It's not about that next toy. It's not about that next job promotion. It's not about that next goal that you have for yourself. It's about here and now. It's about pursuing God and finding pleasure in him and pleasure in the gifts that he gives you every single day, including first and foremost the hard work that is set in front of you. Because when the evil days come, that's what you're going to need. You're not going to need a goal. You're going to need God, and you're going to need the little things, the little pleasures that you often overlook. Well, thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast, and I hope you'll join me for the Brothers Karamazov series. I'm very much looking forward to that, and I hope to see you next week. By now, the 10th year has drawn around in the story. Drawn around? What does that even mean, Mark? For a year to draw around. Jeez.